A US businessman was at the pier of a small Mexican fishing village when a boat, a very small boat, with just one fisherman docked. Inside the boat were several large yellowfin tuna. And the American complimented the Mexican on the quality of his fish and asked how long it had taken to catch them. The Mexican replied, "Well, only a little while, sir." And the American asked why he didn't stay out longer and catch more fish. The Mexican said that he had enough to supply his family's needs. And then the American asked, "But what do you do with the rest of your time?" And the fisherman said, "Well, I play with my children, I take siesta with my wife Maria, I stroll into the village each evening where I sip wine and I play the guitar with my friends. I have a full and very busy life, sir." The American smiled. You see, I am a Harvard MBA, that's a degree in business studies, and I could help you. You should spend more time fishing, and with the proceeds buy a bigger boat. And with the proceeds from the bigger boat, you could buy several boats, and eventually you'd have a fleet. And then instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you would sell directly to the processor, eventually opening your own cannery. You would control the product, the processing, and the distribution. You would, of course, need to leave the small fishing village and move to Mexico City, then Los Angeles, and finally New York, where you would run your expanding enterprise. The Mexican fisherman asked, "But sir, how long will all this take?" The American replied, 15 to 20 years. "But what then, sir?" The American laughed. Here's the best bit. When the time is right, you sell your stock to the public and become very rich. You would make millions. Millions, sir. But then what? Well, then you would retire, move to a small coastal fishing village where you could sleep late and fish a little and play with your kids and take siesta with your wife Maria and stroll to the village in the evenings where you would sip wine and play guitar with your friends. And with just the hint of a twinkle in his eye, the fisherman said, "Sir, are these business degrees hard to get?" The question underlying that parable is the question that Psalm 90 explores. What are you doing with your time? How do you spend your time? And that, of course, depends very much on what we see as important in life. But our relationship to time is, in fact, a much more complex thing than that. For time can generate regret when we realize we haven't made the best use of it. Time can also generate opportunity as we seize the day. And over it all, there is a sense that the clock is ticking, a sense of our mortality. So the psalm wrestles with the problem of time. Is time hard labor, or is every day a gift? And in my Bible, maybe in yours too, there are introductory headings to Psalm 90, 2 of them. The first is that large capital, Book 4, for there are 5 divisions in the Psalms, and this is the 4th, and 17 songs make up this 4th division. All of them were used in temple worship and were sung during the Feast of Tabernacles. That was the festival which celebrated the time in Israel's history when the nation spent 40 years in the wilderness. Remember? The period when the people wandered but knew that God was with them. Which is why the second heading to the psalm in my Bible suggests that Moses is the author. A song of a prayer of Moses, the man of God. But commentators are not sure about that. Although much of the content fits the context of trusting in God, the song also contains, as Anna read it just now, a profound sense of despair and fear. For as the songwriter reflects upon his generation, it seems to be an era of God's judgment upon the nation. Life is a daily struggle. Hope appears thin on the ground. Perhaps then the psalm is a commentary on that time of exile and captivity in Israel's history. And this is how Moses would have commented upon that period had he been alive. Whatever the actual historical background, Psalm 90 says, we spend our days living with 2 great truths. God's eternity on the one hand and our mortality on the other. And the psalm raises this key question. In a world of change and uncertainty, what is it we really hold on to? So let's begin then, firstly, with the framework of faith. We have, says verse 2, we have an eternal God. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We have an eternal God. Faith rests securely upon the character of an eternal God whose nature is everlasting. Nothing is before him and nothing after him. Our God is ageless and limitless. His is the power which holds everything together. His is the glory which defines us as human beings. His is the word which provides the boundaries of truth. And his the voice which commands the winds and the waves. Before creation, before time and space, there was God. And before God, there was nothing but God. In the beginning, God, says the first sentence of the first book of the Bible. At the narrow dot of what we call infinity is God, the uncreated, the self-existent one, filling the cosmos with his majesty. God who owes his being and existence to nothing and to no one, gives being and existence to everything and everyone. That's the God before whom we live our little lives and manage our careers and deal with our relationships and cope with our griefs. For in comparison, all our human experience is short-lived. The headstone on every grave tells the same story. We are merely two dates separated by one tiny hyphen. But God is eternal. He is before us and he is after us. We exist in a universe made and ruled by him, so that whatever happens has reference to him. But it's a world where terrible things do happen, where the Middle East is one chemical attack away from regional war. So how can we live securely when such vulnerability and change is built into everything? Well, because secondly, we have in the eternal God an eternal home. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. God is not just the glorious creator above us, he is the home of his people, with us and among us. The God of the Bible is personal, someone to whom we can relate and around whose eternal nature we can build our security. We are not cast adrift in a world indifferent to us. We are not swept along by forces which are blind to us. We are not homeless. That's what the psalmist is saying. God has made us a home. Himself. He is our eternal home, a secure shelter, a place of belonging, a dwelling place. Now that word for a dwelling is our word for a tent. As I've said, this psalm was sung at the festival which celebrated the way God moved with the children of Israel in their 40-year pilgrimage through the desert. God's presence symbolized in the Ark of the Covenant, which was kept in that tent of meeting. So as they moved, God moved with them. But then, in the person of Jesus, something even more remarkable happened. God actually, physically, put up his tent among us. That's why at the start of John's Gospel we read, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Put up his tent among us. In the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, God makes himself our home. You got it? And this is the framework in which faith operates. God is eternal, before us and after us. But God is personal, with us and among us. And that's how faith makes sense of the journey that we travel. with God as our only true and lasting security. But because that journey is brief, uncertain, and fragile, it involves, secondly, an acceptance of the limitations of life. An acceptance of the limitations of life. God is eternal. But look at verse 3. We are frail. You turn men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of men. If you know your Bible well, that's an echo of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19. Let me give you the backstory of Genesis. In paradise, sadly, tragically, humanity wanted to go it alone, without God in charge. And the most significant consequence of our mutiny was death. For when God in Genesis 2 is described as forming man from the dust of the earth, it was not God's intention to turn man back to dust. And it's vital that we understand that. Death is not natural to creation. It's an alien intruder. Death was never an original part of the experience of those whom God made in his image. And that's why we rail against death and what it does whenever we see its ugly shadow hovering over someone's life, and the suffering that death causes and the separation it produces. That was not how things were. But now, of course, that is how things are. Said Benjamin Franklin, we can be certain of only two things in life: death and taxes. And Psalm 90 gives us the uncomfortable but undeniable truth that everyone dies eventually. No matter the aging creams we put on and the fitness regimes we work out, we are not immortal. And tomorrow, some of us will stand at the graveside of Muriel Hawke, and we will hear the words probably, as for man, his days are like grass, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And the thinking person tomorrow will ask, why is life a descent into illness, a decline into old age? Why are we mortal? Well, here's the answer. In Psalm 90, verse 3, you turn men back to dust. We rejected God in paradise, and we invited this dread enemy into the world. So the commentary upon every life is that of verses 9 and 10 of our passage. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength, yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. All of us, the greatest and the strongest, the fittest and the brightest, we finish our days with a sigh, and the breathing stops, and the light dies, and the darkness comes. Why? Because we are breakable, mortal people under judgment. That's what we are like. But verse 4 tells us what God is like. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. That's human language, of course. Time has no bearing on God. 1,000 years, says the songwriter there, 1,000 years are like a day, no, less than a day, just a few hours in the night to this eternal God. Just think of what has happened in 1,000 years of civilization on planet Earth, from Norman conquest to the conquest of Everest. All that effort and energy, all that change, all those discoveries and inventions, 1,000 years of history. But to God, it's like yesterday. Whereas for us, there in verse 5, in comparison, we are like little sticks of wood swept along by death as in a flood. You see, every human empire thinks the sun will not set on it. Every dictator believes he is invincible. But glorious empires and strong leaders are powerless to prevent the tide of time coming in to wash them away. Even if, as the commentary says, we enjoy the 70 or 80 years of verse 10, it's relatively short, it's messy, and it's difficult. Their span is but trouble and sorrow. Life, says the psalmist then, has its limits. Limited time, limited strength, limited energy. So we need to get real. We need to accept that no one and nothing is forever. We need to learn to tell the time properly. You see, that's the point which the pivotal verse of the psalm, verse 12, makes. Look at it. Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And that can be a very difficult thing to do. You see, when we're young, we think that we have forever. But when we're old, we sometimes think that's it. Our time is over. For some of us, time drags. It can be a burden to have to wait for time to pass. What's the question the small child in the back of the car will often ask on their way to the holiday after just 10 minutes on the road? Dad, are we there yet? But then on the other hand, time flies for some of us. And when we are busy with so much to do, there's not enough time in the day. Do you know, when I was 18, I felt I could conquer the world. I felt I would live forever and never tire. But now, the aches and the pains tell me something different. Now, everything hurts, and what doesn't hurt doesn't work. Now, I look forward to a dull evening. You sit in the rocking chair, and you can't get it going. You're 18 around the neck, you're 42 around the waist, and you're 95 around the golf course. You are proud of your lawnmower. Yet we still number our life in years. So we have birthdays. But the psalmist says, maybe you need to start numbering your days. That's his advice. Which is not merely accept your limitations, it's actually make the most of your opportunities. Number your days. Make the most of the opportunities. For each day, God deposits into the time account of your life exactly the same number of minutes as the person sat next to you this morning. And the issue as you walk out of the building later is this: how am I going to spend that time? On what? On who? The ancient Greeks were great storytellers. One of them, Aeschylus, reckoned that the essential characteristic of the human being was that each person knew the day of his or her death. That is to say, we knew our limits. But in one of Aeschylus' stories, Prometheus, one of the gods, he wanted to change all that. And so Prometheus stole fire from Olympus, and he gave it to humanity, by which we were able to cook food and make weapons and fire pottery. And through the discovery of fire, the entire world of progress and technology opened up. We began to believe that we could surmount any obstacle and solve any problem, even our own mortality. We acted like gods, seeing ourselves as unbeatable. You know, our age is very Promethean. We believe ourselves to be unbeatable. We can solve any problem, even now our own mortality. Our age is so Promethean, with its stolen scientific fire burning out of control. Our unsustainable materialism, which consumes the planet's resources. We are living now in defiance of our human nature and our environment, and in rebellion against the God of heaven. We are Promethean. And to that spirit, the psalmist says, stop. Wise up. Ask God to teach you to number your days. When the reformer Martin Luther commented on that verse, he wrote, "Lord, that we might all be such skilled mathematicians." In Luther's day, the 16th century, the work and role of the priest or pastor was defined as preparing people for a good death. You see, that's one element of my role, I suppose. In a society that lives for pleasure and wants instant gratification, one of the primary tasks of the pastor is to get people to see how short their life, how fleeting their existence, how inevitable their death. And so there is a positive wisdom to be gained by reflecting upon our mortality. When we realize we haven't got forever, we need to make the most of each day. There's an interesting sundial in the back of one of the quads of All Souls College, Oxford. It's a sundial built by Christopher Wren, and the motto in Latin at the foot is this: "The hours pass and are counted against us." So do you see? How are we going to spend the next 24 hours, the next week? Back to the psalm. Although realistic, ultimately it's optimistic, because in verses 13 to 17, the psalmist sees ahead of him the horizons of grace. "Relent, O Lord, how long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days." And the passionate cry of these closing verses is actually a request to God that in the midst of fragile lives, in a world that's passing away, we would find our security in him, and that we would make every second count. So the songwriter longs that God would turn the experience of trusting him through the difficulties into one of blessing. That we would not see uncertainty as necessarily a bad thing. You know, we're not good at life when things can't be fixed, are we? When we have to live with the very messy threads. But most of life is like that. We cannot calculate with absolute precision what will happen and how. But, says the psalmist here, we can still live certainly with uncertainty. Because our certainty isn't in the circumstances, our health, our friendships. Our certainty is in God. He's the one eternal constant. And so the psalmist cries out to God to give us certainty in our uncertainty by making good on his promises. And those promises are referred to in the closing phrases and are to do with God remembering his people. Did you notice how, for the first time in the psalm, at verse 13, you begin to see the capital letters Lord, God's special name? Up to now, God has been described as the sovereign creator of time. But now, he is the covenant Lord of promises. For he is in a special relationship, a covenant relationship with his people. And what the psalmist is asking is that God will turn in covenant love. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love. Make us sing for joy and be glad. Smile upon us. Show us your glory. Bless us. Establish the work of our hands. In other words, don't just be the sovereign God, the creator. Be the God of covenant love. Don't just be the God high above us and outside us. Be the God with us, the God of our history. Don't just be the God of eternal years. Be the God of our days and our moments. Don't just be the God who knows and sees us as the grass that withers, but as the God who establishes the work of our hands. Now that is the transformation possible with this God. For with the God of the covenant, life is significant and valuable. It can all count Each day of our 80 years and 10, none of them is meaningless. With this God, we're defined ultimately not as dust and grass, but by being at home and secure with him. You see how that in a covenant relationship, our days can be joyful, our children can have a heritage. That's what he says. A legacy we will leave. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the Lord's favor rest upon us, establish the work of our hands for us. This is a legacy that we can leave for generations to come. We can pray that the work of our hands will endure. What a marvelous prayer that we can pray today. Lord, make what I do and how I live significant. Help me this week to tell the time properly, to see the value of my work and my family and my career and my leisure. For with this God, time is satisfaction, not frustration. With this God, time is not a burden, but an opportunity. So as I close, notice this. Faith lives with the tension of God's eternity and our mortality. And prayer wrestles with that tension. It lives within the framework of faith that God is eternal and that he is our eternal home. Faith accepts the limits of life. We are not immortal. But faith also sees the horizons of grace. That with this God, life has meaning and significance. And with this God, death will have no dominion. For he is the everlasting God, bound to his people by an everlasting covenant of love from which we can never be separated. You see, tomorrow when we bury Muriel, our grief is transformed. We will thank God for her life, and we will rejoice because death does not go unanswered. For although death is at work in the world, it has been defeated by the love of covenant grace. How do I know that? The arrival of such love is the great promise of the Old Testament Psalms like this one and the prophets. God would bring about a new era in which he would remember mercy. And that new era would begin when God would send his anointed king to meet the terms of the covenant. God's chosen one, who would live a perfect life and die a sacrificial death, but will be raised again to declare his authority and glory. So you see, we need to read the final verses of the psalm in the light of Jesus. For God did turn, he did relent, he had compassion, he kept his covenant promises and sent the covenant man Jesus to bless us with his grace. For through his cross and resurrection, Jesus destroys death. He makes our troubles light and momentary in comparison to the glory to come. All our earthly longings for home, for security, for significance are in fact echoes of that glory to come, our heavenly home. And it's that call that we hear as we come now around the communion table. To this table where we find grace and forgiveness and peace. Here in the bread and the wine are symbols of the Word made flesh. His body broken for us, his blood shed. So let me invite you, as we stand to sing now this next hymn, to come to this table and find your security in Christ. I want you consciously, as you take the bread and the wine, to place your fragile, fleeting life before God, so that his cross and empty tomb may speak of the one who can be trusted as the constant in a world of change. As we take communion, let's remember that the Lord of time, who came into time, makes sense of all our days and all our years. And he wants us to number those days and to gain a heart of wisdom as we do. So the song we're singing as we come to communion is the hymn, "In heavenly love abiding, no change my heart shall fear, and safe is such confiding, for nothing changes here. The storm may roar without me, my heart may low be laid, but God is round about me. And can I be dismayed?" Let's stand and sing together.